Hey, thank you. Welcome, everybody. And thank you for your patience and collaboration. We had a couple of technological glitches starting out. So welcome to the Research Group in Pursuit of Validity webinar. I'm Christina Saint-Onge, one of the leads for the Research Group in Pursuit of Validity. I'm a professor here at the University of Sherbrooke, and I'll be your moderator for today. So for those of you who don't know us, the Research Group in Pursuit of Validity, because I see a lot of new faces, we were a group of like-minded researchers, educators, administrators that are interested in issues of validity, of assessment data interpretation, of course, in the context of professionalizing pathways. That's my best translation for parcours professionnalisant. So we're a bilingual group, so feel free to ask questions in French or English. I know we have a couple of trilingual attendees today, but we'll limit to French and English. We can manage that. We'll make sure that if you ask a question in French, one of the group members will be able to translate for Bruno. So today, this is my immense pleasure of welcoming Professor Bruno Zumbo, who accepted to give this webinar. So when I look at the list of attendees, I know that Professor Zumbo doesn't require a lot of formal introduction. So I decided to share with you why I was keen on inviting Professor Zumbo to present today. So the first time I virtually met Professor Zumbo was at a colleague's thesis defense. I was a junior, and I was quite impressionable at that time. And I started looking into this person, this researcher, what they had accomplished. And I really appreciate the nuance in Professor Zumbo's approach to validity, and I hope that you will as well. So the way we'll function, Professor Zumbo will give his talk, 40 to 50 minutes. We'll have some Q&A. And for those of you that can stay on if you want to, we'll have some informal fire chat for about an hour afterwards. So without further ado, thank you so much, Bruno, for accepting to present today, and I leave the floor to you. You are on mute. Sorry.
Good. I'm actually better on mute. This is great. This is going to be exciting. Thank you so much. What I wanted to say, first and foremost, is thank you to Christina for the invitation and for the members of the groupe de recherche on enquête de validité. You have to please excuse me for my terrible French. Was a time in my life where I was more bilingue when I was a professor at the University of Ottawa. In the last decade, in the last century, actually, sorry, in the last century, in 1990, I started in 1989, 1990, I started as a professor at the University of Ottawa. So I am truly honored. Thank you so much for this opportunity to share with you some of the ideas. I look forward to engaging. I'm going to try and keep my my speaking to about 45 minutes or so. I want to address really what looks like a mouthful, but actually is really reflecting where my ideas have been going and my thinking's been going for about 15 or so years, 15 to 20 years. And it's on the area of measurement validity at the nexus of data science, digital innovation, and a social justice imperative. And you're going to see me really bringing in this idea that of embracing the many ways of being human. And I'm a professor at the University of British Columbia, and I suppose for the purposes of my institution, it's worthwhile me saying that I hold the title of Professor in Distinguished University Scholar. I'm funded by the Canadian federal government with a Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in psychometrics and measurement, and I also hold the Paragon UBC professorship in psychometrics and measurement. That's a lot of psychometrics and measurement. I hope I can live up to all the titles. So let me share with you a little bit. Let's see if I can get my mouse going and everything going in the right direction here. There's 4 sections to what I want to talk about briefly. I want to set the stage and really thinking about 3 big challenges or hurdles. And in there, I want to really motivate a guiding principle, which I reflect in the title, which is the many ways of being human. It's an idea that I've been working with. I think I first spoke about it about a decade ago when I talked about the many ways of being human from a methodological look at the many ways of being human, how a methodologist thinks about it, in particular I do. It's an invited address at the American Educational Research Association, I think in San Francisco, about a decade ago. Then from there, I want to talk about the many ways of being human plays itself out in our theorizing about and conceptualization of validity. And here I'm going to try and motivate this view of validity that I've been developing and working through the details of over the about 15 to 20 years, with validity as contextualized and pragmatic explanation and its implications for validation practice. And then I want to see a few words about how the many ways of being human manifests itself in assessment research, and the motivation will be here some remarks around fairness and equity, and woven into that is some tensions around intersectionality and what's in the horizon. That's a lot of material. Of course, there's a video this is being recorded, be made available, and so will my slides be made available in the reference list. So that's not a problem at all from all of that point of view. The main thesis is that there are several big challenges or hurdles when considering methodologies used to ensure validity and fairness and equity in assessment testing, and actually in surveys as well. I speak about all of those areas together, the guiding principle being the many ways of being human itself. I use the metaphor of a hurdler, with some hurdles being more easily cleared. In contrast, others we collectively as a community of scholars have until relatively recently successfully skirted. In case you're wondering, I'm not sure. I'm somewhere between a blend of the chap in the bottom left-hand corner and the sleek, athletic person in the middle. At this point in my life, I think I imagine myself more as the one in the middle, but that's hardly the case. What this highlights for us is that what I want to do today is really talk at a meta theory level. Some of you may know my work, if you know it at all, from the work I do in sort of, I'm originally trained as a mathematical scientist and a statistician. I originally trained actually in pure mathematics, my doctoral work, in an area called, in the area of mathematical analysis, measure theory, real analysis. You're not going to see any of that today. Today, what I want to do is talk at a meta-conceptual level and a meta-theoretical level. Of course, if you wish, the conceptualization of measurement from a analysis point of view, a real analysis point of view. For example, I had a paper in 2020 with Ed Kroc and I in the Journal of Mathematical Psychology, in which you see us bringing in some measure theoretic. Those ideas are still there and they actually motivate it. But today, for any of you who are looking for some detailed theorems and definitions and formulas, you'll be perhaps pleasantly disappointed. That was a joke. Hope some of you smile. So here's the 3 challenges that I want to bring into. And today's work in this program of research really reflects what happens when a mathematical scientist decides that pure mathematics is not what they want to do on a full-time basis. And I started studying philosophy of science as well in graduate school. And so you'll see some philosophical ideas, notions in logic and ethics, philosophy of science through all of this. From this vantage point where I'm sitting, a little over 3 decades now as a professor, I'm sort of, today I'm seeing there are some three big challenges or hurdles that are motivating this area of work. There are others, smaller and larger, but these are the three I want to focus on. To what extent are we measuring our attribute or our intended attribute or competency of interest with the test assessment or surveying used? And what are the implicit and explicit conceptions of fairness and equity of the methodology of my choice? And in my response to that is my approach is embodies statistical and psychometric models and ecological model of item and test performance that you're going to see me say a few remarks about in about 15 minutes or so. And the case I make in this for the second question is around, by observing the testing situation, we hope to identify clues about the way the test is constructed, understood, and performed as a social occasion. And you'll see at the bottom of my slides, there are some citations, and the ones that are not there, I put as a reference list at the back of all the slides. So the key thing here, so it's the many ways of being human, but how this plays itself out is this idea of that fact that by observing the testing situation, right, I hope to identify clues about the way the test is constructed, understood, and performed as a social occasion. I think a first principle here where I begin is that a test is a power tool. And by that, I'm using it in the sort of the notion of social theory and a social metaphor. And Elena Shahami from Israel reminded me of this when I gave the Messick address in 2002, I think it was, 2001. I gave the Messick address to the International Language Testing Association, the Language Testing Research Conference, LTRC. And in there, something that struck me in the feedback was Shahami's comment that tests are in fact power tools. I think we all know this, and tests and assessments and surveys, and it really doesn't matter whether it's on the micro scale in your own classroom, in a larger sort of national scale where we certify or license medical practitioners, teachers, or even in international comparative research in education, health surveys, health, well-being, quality of life. In all cases, they are power tools, and there is a social performance that is going on here. And I think this basic idea of, by observing the testing situation, I, as a scholar of validity, hope to identify the clues about the way the test is constructed, understood, and performed as a social occasion. And really, Addie, Maddox, and I think Brian may even be on in the audience today, where we talk about assembled validity, we try and exploit this idea a lot. The third big hurdle is, how are my conceptions of fairness and equity in an environment where there is a great deal of technology, a great deal of computational innovation? How are my conceptions of fairness and equity informed by the societal demographics, logic, organization of our political and social systems, and shaped by, in my case in particular, my own social values as I live them? To what extent, the response to that, to what extent might we be measuring unintentionally other unimportant constructs, attributes, competencies that are not meant to be included in our inferences of our attribute or domain of interest, such as conformity to expected cultural norms, for example, related to, for example, multiculturalism, ethnicity, gender identity, gender and roles. I know there are people from, I noticed on the, when folks were coming in, names I recognized of friends from all over the world. And so we had folks coming in Europe, colleagues from Spain, in the US and Canada. You're going to hear multiculturalism as a Canadian concept, which is slightly different than the melting pot idea that we have particularly manifested south of the 49th parallel in North America. And so we try to get a sense of, how do these come together? And in what way are we reflecting these ideas? Going back to the element, the guiding principle of the many ways of being human. So there's three big sort of questions. To what extent are we measuring our attribute or competency of interest with the test, assessment, or survey? You can see I've really thread complicated line of constructs, attributes, competencies. I'm not much interested in that debate today. I'm glad to have it some other day. But for the purposes today, we can think construct, attribute, or competency. Then what are the implicit and explicit conceptions of fairness and equity, really of the methodology of my choice? And that's, in my case, I'm talking about an ecological model and this idea of observing of observing the testing situation and how we from there hope to identify clues about the test, the way the test is constructed, understood, and performed as a social occasion. And of course, then how do, if you wish, my social values and my values, my personal values come through, in particular, and how are we then measuring unintentionally? And the fact that we're measuring things unintentionally, more than one attribute, more than one construct, more than one competency, should be at this point self-evident. So actually goes an idea that goes quite a ways back in the field of psychometrics. Perhaps the most recent embodiment of that and thorough embracing of that has been the work of Bill Stout and his colleagues and former graduate students who take a look at a sort of a multidimensional view of validity measurement. Stout actually was someone I studied in pure mathematics and in probability theory. He's a measure value probability theorist, and so it's not too surprising from where I stand, having come out of the same area of mathematics where he had his career. It was not too surprising that he began to think about the fact that you are measuring more than one aspect of this, more than one component, more than one construct, more than one attribute. And Bill's done a beautiful line of work in that area. I'm embracing this idea, and that, we're unintentionally, in fact, I would argue there's no way of actually measuring without capturing those other attributes. For example, if you're doing anything that's presented in text form as questions, I don't know whether you know it or not, you are measuring some aspect of language. I mean, there's reading involved, there's visual presentation. These should not be ignored. You're also bringing in matters of cultural norms, expectations, social values that are embodied in our test design and development. All right, let's keep going. The principle, as I see it, that there are many ways of being human is the core of how I live and theorize and how I express my experience and identity. And I have no trouble using the words I and my here. I own those ideas and I live them. Over the last 30 years, my experience has been that the field of assessment, psychometrics, statistics, has tended to go into a sort of a moral panic over notions of gender identity, gender expression, aspects of cultural expression. Well, today I'm going to continue this line of work that I've been doing for a while to shake that up. Someone who is in the core of the more mathematical end of this field is saying to you, listen, it's time we embrace these other ideas and stop the moral panic over gender identity, gender expression, and the cultural aspects. And the fact assessment, survey design, responding to assessments, tests, and surveys is a performative social and cultural act. The core of my theorizing, the methods I develop or advocate aim to challenge that view of the moral panic and aim to honor the many ways of being human and capturing the human experience. So how does the many ways of being human play itself out in our theorizing and conceptualization of validity? Well, much of what travels under the umbrella of validity theory and validation practices is the methodology of measurement, testing, assessment, and surveys. How should one go about doing and evaluating measurement validity? How should one go about doing and evaluating a measurement, a testing, assessment, or a survey? The question is one of the methodology, if you wish, or meta methodology. This is honoring one of my former mentors, Bill Rosenboom at the University of Alberta, philosopher of science, logician, psychometrician, mathematician. The late Bill Rosenboom passed away not that long ago. It breaks my heart to have my former mentors passing, and in a selfish way, I need them to stand at least behind me so I can rely on them. But Bill is with us today, thinking with us. So it's one of a question of meta-methodology. Like taking a quick over-the-shoulder look back, historically, that we can say that historically we have moved from a correlation or factor analysis to establish factorial validity as sufficient evidence for validity to an integrative approach to the process of validation, involving a complex weighing of various bodies or sources and bits of evidence. Hence, by nature, bringing the validation process squarely into the domain of disciplined inquiry and science. Something I've been saying is 2007 and earlier. As Ben Shear and I in 2014, in a book chapter in 2021, there is a webinar presentation that's online with the slides, as we show over the past 50 years, and others have shown this as well. We're not alone, but in particular, I want to point to what we were looking at is over the last 50 years, the concepts and theories of test validity have grown increasingly expansive, and the methods for test validation have become increasingly complex and multifaceted. This lovely paper that I saw not that long ago by my hosts here, some folks here, Christina and others, that really point up that there are many validities. There are many validity theories and conceptions. That, in fact, in my opinion, is a sign of a healthy state in our discipline. It's time that we started challenging some of these, and there are many ideas. I'm actually fine with that. In fact, I encourage it entirely. Shear and I state that validity theorists have highlighted the important distinction between validity and validation, and in particular, Denny Borsboom and I and others have really been, but Denny in particular early on, and I explicitly say it in a book chapter of mine in 2007 in the Handbook of Statistics, and again in a chapter in the Maryland conference, the University of Maryland conference on validity theory, that of the distinction between validity and validation, where validity is the concept, the idea, a definition of validity, and validation is the practice. It's like the distinction between method and methodology. Whereas validity is the property or relationship we're trying to judge, validation is an activity geared towards understanding and making that judgment. And as I tried to remind folks in 2009, I tried to remind us of the importance that a guiding rationale, if you wish, a validity theory, must play in selecting and applying appropriate analyses, that is validation. While Borsboom et al. Note that failing to distinguish between validity and validation can also lead to conceptual and methodological confusion. So I actually make the case that one needs to have a guiding rationale. And in a moment, I'll even explain to you why. It's kind of obvious, I think, but we'll say it. And Denny Borsboom and his colleagues continue to remind us that failing to distinguish between validity and validation can lead and has led to conceptual and methodological confusion. In fact, one of the fundamental confusions that it's led to is that it's confused method, or better still, let me be clear, it's confused how we do something with the definition of what we're trying to do. So validity is now a factor analysis. Validity is now a correlation. Validity is now a cognitive decomposition or a cognitive analysis. That is not validity. That's how we do it. So let's not confuse how we go about, right, judging this property versus what is the property itself. And I think Denny and his colleagues did an absolutely lovely job of really separating that. It's a psych review paper. These authors are highlighting the importance of having a clear concept of validity, which can be used to guide the use of validation methods. Frankly, at this point in the development of assessment and survey practice, it's not as important which of the several views or quote unquote theories of validity one adopts, as it is that someone adopts one and uses it to guide their validation practices. It's a book, edited volume of mine, I think it was in 2014 that it came out with Eric Chan and I in Springer Press, where we reported systematic reviews of the literature in different areas the social behavioral and health sciences, including in health and medical education, and looked at how, if you wish, the genre of validation practices, then the writing of validity. Some other people have taken on that idea and tried it in different areas. Flake at McGill, I think earlier at York, took on that idea and brought it to in areas of social psychology, and have others. And we're not the first to do it per se, although we're the first to really focus on the genre. And what we found in that, in all of these, I think it was 18 different chapters and in about 15 different domains in the social behavioral health sciences, looking at the genre of validation reporting, the practices of it, there was barely to no mention of any guiding framework or principle of validity. Periodically, there was a Crombeck and Meal reference. Actually, they got most of the references were just passing legitimization type references that, was to point to the reader, oh, gosh, I know Crombeck and Meal 56. But again, it's not integrated. A few mentions to Messick, but very little. That's changed a little bit in the last, I'm going to say, 2 or 3 years, where I'm seeing beautiful work building on Mike Kane's very lovely, elaborate notions of an argument based, and you'll see Mike's ideas beginning to shape some validation practice. So I'm not going to attribute that to the work by Eric Chan and I, although in every grant application that if any of you will review it, that'll be a sentence, it's because of us. Well, reality is there's a percolating ideas in the field already. So setting aside any ego move on my part, I think what we were doing, what Eric Chan and I were doing in this edited volume with Springer Press in 2014 was actually reflecting somewhat a spirit of the time. And so, and Mike Kane's work has been a nice guiding element of it. It's not the only approach, but certainly is lovely. The standards, the AERA, APA, and CME standards have been looked at, as well as the European SAND standards and the International Test Commission. But pick one. At this point, I don't care what you pick. Just pick it and use it as a guiding principle. Today, I'm going to talk mostly about my own view, which is an explanation-focused view. I've espoused a different sort of explanatory view and it's more in line with the work of Crombeck and Meal and Denny Borsboom. It's a different view of explanation that I have than Denny has. And Crombeck and Meal, of course, in 1956 would have been a particular philosophic tradition of explanation. But I've espoused a different explanatory view. My roots are more firmly in a pragmatic approach, particularly inference to the best explanation, or IBE as it's sometimes called. And it's an IBE, or inference to best explanation type strategy. You actually see reference to that in my 2017 chapter in the handbook and earlier. Second, in separating validity per se from the validation process, then I have a clearly a sense of the role of social consequences, justice, and fairness in the validation process, and separate from validity itself. This recognized measurement as a power tool, in a public debate and public policy, and Addie and Maddox and I really build on that. The basic idea underlying my explanatory approach is that if one can understand why an individual responded, for example, a certain way to an item or scored a particular value on a scale, then that will go a long way toward bridging the inferential gap between test or survey scores, or even latent variable scores, and the constructs. Please, let's not confuse the latent variable and a construct. I beg you, when are we going to stop this? In fact, I promise I'll retire the day all of you stop doing this. I'll go retire and pursue my deep passion in flower arranging and disco dancing. And don't kid yourself. Be ready for both. That was hope some of you smiled. My point is that the idea is that the explanatory approach says that the explanation help us bridge this inferential gap. And furthermore, I don't really much care if you believe that that inferential gap is slow, because it is, it's an obvious element. So it's a task that's clearly measuring um, organizational knowledge, or it's clearly measuring math ability, or it's clearly measuring well-being, or it's clearly measuring a particular attribute of being a physician, a nurse, a health practitioner, a physiotherapist, occupational therapist, where I've heard, well, Bruno, what else could it measure? No, the point is exactly that, is that it could be measuring many other things, and that even as obvious as the statement is, having this quote unquote face, I'm going to say it, but I'm going to pull it back, face validity, there is still an inferential gap. There's an inferential jump. And the idea is that the validity theory and the explanatory approach that I'm offering in particular is meant to bridge that inferential gap. In fact, in my opinion, several, but not all, of the main ideas of validity theory are intending to do that, but not all of them. All right. Very briefly, a meta theory, you'll see I presented this in a monograph of mine last year. There's an entire chapter devoted to it. This actually is a view of validity that Anita Hubley and I first introduced in a paper in, I think this was in Social Indicators Research, a paper that we did on consequences. You'll see that there's values are throughout. We're going to expose that. There's theories. There's a big, there is this circle here, this dash circle there inside it. And you'll see arrows from construct or competency, domain to instrument, and then you'll see these arrows about it. I actually begin to sort of now overlay notions that bringing together an argument approach and bringing an argument view, sort of a Kane, Bachman kind of ideas, to validity theory and validation in a model of this sense here. So you're seeing scoring, generalization, extrapolation, and you're seeing relevance, utility, consequences. You're seeing intended and unintended social personal consequences with arrows going both ways, intended social and personal, intended social and unintended social and personal consequences. And that both of those, so that the meaning shapes those and the inferences one makes. And furthermore, they shape this. And you'll see highly controversial idea, but actually isn't controversial at all, in my opinion, and reflects work in the history of science more generally, and the philosophy of science, the philosophy of measurement. But you can see that these consequences and use go back and actually feed back to the construct itself. So you'll see that there's scoring, generalization, extrapolation, utilization in that context as types of evidence. You're seeing utilization shaping consequences, unintended and intended consequences. So let me then say, so if I can go back, this in a way is one, just a brief picture of how I've brought together some of Kane's ideas, and I'll assume you're familiar with Mike's work. If not, I have some in the appendix of these slides. I have a couple of slides devoted to it. But I'm beginning to bring together this argument and the strengths of the argument-based approach with the larger theoretical orientation that Messick and I and Nita Hubley and that whole tradition have been arguing for. So this is sort of a hybrid in here, and I unpack it a great deal in that end. So I want to say a few words then about arguments and explanations. First, I know or assume that you are well aware of current argument-based approaches of people like Mike Kane and Lyle Bachman in particular, but there are others. At a more conceptual level, we might compare the argument-based approach and explanation-based approach, or this view, by posing the following question. Is an explanation an argument, or is an argument an explanation? Ben Shear and I have been talking about this idea going back nearly 10 years. It's an important question, I think. Is an explanation an argument, or is an argument an explanation? It's probably multiple answers, but turning to logic, explanations are seen as types of arguments. There are at least two types of arguments, justificatory and explanatory. And there's a lovely book by Synod Armstrong and and Fogelin in 2010 that I cite there, that actually unpacks a little bit of this at a fairly introductory level. So there's two types of arguments, justificatory and explanatory. These are distinguished largely by purpose, or use rather than form. So purpose or use rather than form. The explanatory provides an explanation of why or how something we agree about has happened, and how did we arrive at a particular interpretation. That's explanation. That's what I've been focusing on. Well, in this sort of hybrid approach that I've recently introduced earlier in 2021, and now that's hybrid, bringing together the argument-based tradition and the more explanatory tradition. And if you look at my paper in chapter 9, 2009, Cronbach and Meehl, Borsboom, and I are all really within this theoretical tradition of explanation with different views of what explanation means, right? Cronbach and Meehl was a 1956 or 1915 sort of a view of explanation. In fact, that's where the nomenological net and law-like relationships come out of. Then there's Borsboom's approach to sort of a causal view in mind that is more expansive, being a sort of a pragmatic, more in the tradition of explanations from a pragmatic point of view. We'll talk about that later. So there's the explanation, and versus the justificatory, which provides reasons for belief. Why should I accept the proposed interpretation? And that really is a very nice, the justificatory approach is really what you see in that Mike Kane has exposed and brought forward a great deal. In fact, as Kane acknowledges, Cronbach started that kind of idea and Kane built on it and really expanded it a great deal. And there's others, Lyle Bachman, Kane, are the two that come to mind for me. The most Lyle Bachman coming out of the language assessment field, although his influence is wider. So there, in terms of types of arguments, these are distinguished largely by purpose or use rather than form. Explanatory versus justificatory. Focusing on the purpose of the argument brings our attention to who the audience is. This may be important. The interpretive argument as explanatory, or in the validity argument as justificatory. These two sorts of arguments often have similar forms, moving through, if you wish, chains of inferences, but their purposes and the context in which we use them often differ. Please note that inference, the best explanation, essentially combines these. So I have a sort of a, or best explanation approaches in general, but IBE or inference the best, they really essentially combine these. First, we formulate an explanation, then a justificatory argument to convince us is indeed the best possible explanation. So I like to believe, in a sense, I was always pointing in this direction of the merger, or this hybrid of sort of the Kane, early Cronbach, Kane, Bachman kind of approaches, and the if you wish, the tradition that comes out of Cronbach and Meehl. And so moving to an IBE, or inference the best explanation, essentially combines these two ideas. There is an interesting parallel here between focusing on the use of a test to guide validation work. Similarly, we can focus on the use of an argument to guide our construction of the argument. Although it is clear how the argument serves to evaluate the particular pieces of the interpretive argument, what standards ought to be used to judge whether the interpretive argument in context is complete or serves its purpose? And that's really one of the questions that Messick in 95 brought up. Right. So although it's clear that the validity argument serves to evaluate the particular pieces of the interpretive argument, what standards ought to be used to judge whether the interpretive argument in context is complete or serves its purpose? Perhaps in response to that, I offer the following. Perhaps by conceptualizing the interpretive argument as explanatory, we gain a new set of criteria for explanations by which to evaluate our interpretive argument. by framing the two parts of the validity argument as justificatory and explanatory justificatory, we can leverage various forms of evaluating explanations in the service of developing our interpretive argument. In addition to Keynes' clarity, coherence, plausibility of inference and assumption, implicit assumptions can be partly harmful because they can be left unanswered. And we're going to come back to that in a bit. So just as measures are fallible, hence there's a need for validation, so too are arguments fallible. And some arguments may be solid in one context, but not in another. Hence, we need an analogous procedure to be sure our arguments are sufficient in a particular case, the same way we evaluate whether test or use interpretation is sufficient in a particular context. So criteria for evaluation to the best, criteria for inference to the best of explanations, I think, are helpful here. Here we can think of selecting the best interpretive argument. In some, as Armstrong and Fogelin in 2010 state, in some, the hypothesis provides the best explanation when it's more explanatory, powerful, falsifiable, modest, simple, and conservative than any competing hypotheses. So according to this view, validity per se is not established until one has an explanatory model of the variation of the item responses, or the scale scores and variables, mediating, moderating, otherwise affecting the response outcome. Stall hurdle, I believe it's in the spirit of Cronbach-Camille of the strong form. Furthermore, overlooking the importance of explanation and validity, we've focused overly heavily on validation process, and as a result, we've lost our way, in my opinion. This is not to suggest that the activities of the process of validation, such as correlations, criterion, convergent measure, dimensionality, item response modeling, differential item or test function, are irrelevant or should be stopped. Quite the opposite. They should be focused towards explanation. They should be aimed towards explanation, explanatory views. So my aim is to refocus our attention on why we are conducting these analyses, that is to support our claim of the inferences for the measure. I'm not going to say too much about the limits of the traditional approach, but basically they're descriptive rather than explanatory. And so here I want to lay the groundwork to expand the evidential basis for test validation by providing a richer explanation of the process of responding and really moving us into a science of measurement. I want to say just a few words about, and then I'm going to wrap it up so we can have a conversation. I want to say a few words about how the many ways of being human manifests itself in assessment research. Well, and in case you're wondering, explanation is driven by this notion of the many ways of being human. You're going to see this in a moment here. And I also, here I want to just say a few words about fairness, and then I want to bring out these tensions in terms of intersectionality and what is on the horizon. So just in a few minutes, I'm going to say some of this, and you folks will be able to have access to the slides and spend a bit more time on it on your own. I want to focus here that as a nice case, as a nice example of what's motivating this many ways of being human in terms of explanatory models is to sorry, my computer screen's just coming up here. I want to take on the case of sort of fairness in assessment testing and surveys. And that's the case I want to use as a motivation to describe this. In studies of fairness, gender has, in the main, been characterized in the binary as biological sex, wherein binary biological sex differences on item performance are eventually explained by item characteristics such as item format and item content. As I described in 2007 in my third generation diff paper, gender more properly should be considered a social construction. I'm not going into breaking new ground here. You don't have to go as far as thinking about it. It's a beautiful work by people like Judith Butler and other theorists. I'm just saying it's widely regarded in the social sciences that we should consider gender as a social construction, among other variables that we're going to come back to in a moment. And gender differences on item performance are explained by contextual or situational variables, ecological variables, if you wish, such as institutionalized gender roles, classroom size, socioeconomic status, teaching practice, parenting, and many other elements that are this construction within our social roles and values. So here's an instantiation of how I want to bring this explanatory models, this notion of the many ways of being human coming together to look at this. I don't think there's anything particularly revolutionary, although I will tell you, in 2007 and later in, I think it was 2014, and where we took this a step further. Some reviewers were just refusing to accept this. Absolutely, saying things like, "Well, how were we supposed to think this way? How are we supposed to conceptualize assessment?" And I'm like, catch up. The rest of the social sciences have been doing this for 50 some years, if not longer. So it's time for us to catch up, frankly, myself included. We believe that these richer ecological variables have been largely ignored in relation to explanations for and causes of diff, for example, in terms of fairness or dimensionality, and the focus on test format, content, cognitive processes, and test dimensionality that is really pervasive in the second generation of diff. So in 2007, I began to lay some of the groundwork. In 2015, actually, in the same journal, Language Assessment Quarterly, we began to unpack this third generation diff and the ecology of item responding. This involves things like linked class variables. Most recently, in September, I gave an address to the International Society for Quality of Life Studies, in which I introduced a grade of membership model for diffs, so that individuals actually can have membership in more than one latent class. And the work is there. I've done it. I first introduced the idea in 2021 September in this keynote address to the International Society for Quality of Life Studies. Again, you can find that on my website, the video, the slides, and there's more papers. There's papers coming out right now that are going to be under review that begin to say, if we're going to drive our thinking, we need to move to models that, for example, a grade of membership model being one of them. This has been seen a great deal. This is one sort of this really looks like a Bromfenbrenian. I'm not a developmental psychologist, but you look at item and test performance, and you can see the sort of various ways of depicting this. Other people have used other ideas. This ecological view has become introduced. It's many years ago now. It's a paper by myself and Mick Legellen. About 15 years ago or longer, where we introduced it. It's been this ecological model has begun to take the spirit. They're not necessarily citing our work for it. It's being rediscovered, but that's fine. Listen, as long as we're moving in the direction, I don't much care if we cite these papers or not. My H-index, which my deans and others and funders care about, is healthy enough. I don't much care about that. I want the field to move forward with it. Take the work, learn from what we're doing, begin this sort of ecological approaches. It's in the water these days. The traditional view follows social address model, a sort of criterion of group differences that spills over to test validation and group differences. Using the common social address approach to group comparisons, or classification to groups might be confused with fixed biological or ethnic classifications. And we're going to come back to this fixed idea in one moment. As John Stuart Mill in 1848 wrote, of all the vulgar modes of escaping the consideration of the effect of social and moral consequences, social moral influences on the mind, the most vulgar is attributing the diversities of conduct and character to inherent natural differences. In fact, perhaps that should just be the only quotation. That's my whole presentation. 1848, John Stuart Mill. And I think that's entirely the case. It's attributing it to something inherent in natural differences. So in a series of chapters and papers between 1998 and 2021, I've made the case that the aim is identifying the determinants or explanatory theory of task item score variation, and the explanation is the best basis for strong validity claims. I take an ecological systems approach, Bronfenbrenner, if you wish. It's not the only approach, it's a great start. Most research on response processes focus on cognitive factors. I want to go larger. I talk a lot about in vivo and in vitro in a keynote address I gave some years ago in Glasgow. Again, it's on my website, my personal website as well. You can see the video and the slides. Began to explore this notion of in vivo and in vitro views of assessment and how to think about consequences and side effects. And there I talk about off-label use. I bring this idea from some areas in health and pharmacology about off-label use, and I do that in the Glasgow, and that's a keynote address to the, I think it was the European Association. It'll have to, forgive me, it's, I can ping up a reference for you in a bit. So here I want to move it to shine a spotlight on test takers' behavior, stance, gesture, motivation, affect, besides cognition. A few more comments I want to make, and then I'm going to turn it to a bit of a discussion. I hope I've provoked some thought, some response, some thinking. Political context, consequences of testing, assessment, data usage, and matters of social justice are core of equity and fairness, and I will make the case they are at the core of assessment survey design, assessment survey analysis, and furthermore of these statistical models. I have a particular Bayesian leaning in some of my work, and I've even written about it. I'm a sort of a Diffinetti kind of leanings, and those ideas can be adapted and used in this notion right here about equity, fairness, and thinking about the various sort of, if you wish, drivers or the reasons for the responses. Let me say a few things that I want to bring up, and then I'm going to pass it on. What my approach to fairness equity implies, it implies really a concern for intersectionalities, and it's actually a concept that I've mentioned before, and I must be frank, sometimes I think some of the ideas that I bring forward are people, I don't think, pick up on them because I cut such a large swath that sometimes it's a little hard perhaps to follow all the threads, even in one piece. Today is a good example. But I've been talking about intersectionalities actually for a while. And by intersectionalities, I mean the interconnected nature of social categorizations. And I'm bringing the idea of intersectionality, the theories of intersectionality, to the field of psychometric modeling, statistical modeling, assessment, consequences, validity, assessment design. And it's about the interconnected nature of social categorizations, be they personal categories, gender, race, ethnicity, social class. It's not about interactions the way we talk about them in our methodology courses. So please, let's stop. They're not interaction terms in statistical models. That's too limiting. We're really here in intersectionalities. It's about the nature of social categorization. In short, it's about the many ways of being human. At the core of that intersectionality are overlapping and interdependent systems of advantage and disadvantage, including the potential for discrimination. And the way I'm using intersectionality, which is really informed and really by fairly widely known theory, the social sciences, the way I'm using intersectionality, these advantages, disadvantage, as well as discrimination, apply to our personal intersectionalities. In addition, my use of intersectionality reflects the intersectionality of methodological and theoretical challenges in researching assessment. The early tensions in the history of assessment, survey design, survey analysis, measurement studies, there's been a tension between the social science scholars with psychometricians and assessment specialists, survey design specialists. They came from psychometricians telling us that intersectionality is for science-denying postmodernists. Not true at all. Not true at all. Perhaps some of these science-denying postmodernists were vocal, but intersectionality is not about science-denying postmodernists. Although, listen, some science-denying postmodernists are some of my closest friends, and they do have an important message to send. but there was an early tension. The social science scholars being critical of what we do. In fact, tests and assessments are being rejected in some areas, rightfully so. In health professional education and evaluation, you're seeing this kind of work being rejected. And it really comes out, and you see it in educational assessment, psychological assessment, you're seeing it in things like for the SAT, and you're seeing it for various other testing programs. Fair Test is actually doing a lovely criticism in the United States. And I think it's playing an important role to keep everyone honest, including the industrial testing complex that's built up around us. But it's come a lot from, psychometricians and others telling us that intersectionality is for science-denying postmodernists. Very recent ideas in the 2021 NCME Summer Seminar and the recent Queen's ETS Conference in Canada, hosted by, jointly by ETS, Leanne Petsula at ETS Canada, and my colleagues at Queen's University, Saad and others, Saad and others, and my own research program point to the contrary. Right? We point to the contrary. It's not about science. It's now becoming, intersectionality is becoming core of what we do. And that many psychometric-minded scholars use social and personal intersectionality to do good work. My own research program shows that to understand complex social phenomena, you need a sufficiently fine-grained and deeply interwoven categories to discover differential effects. And here I'm really being influenced as much by my friend Brian Maddox, in the UK, an anthropologist of educational assessment, and being influenced by Brian a great deal in all this. My hope is that the narrative of disciplinary disciplinary traditions in collision is a thing of the past, and that this new view leads to the overall improvement of the quality of life of students and citizens of the world, which is really about the many ways of being human. From a philosophical lens, my research program highlights that the use and interpretation of assessment tests and surveys makes particular kinds of statements about an educational phenomena of interest, for example, a knowledge domain or even a health status and health measurement, whose definitions rely on normative standards. The definitions of these rely on normative standards. These normative statements make claims about how things should or ought to be, how to value them, which things are good or bad, and which actions are right or wrong. Empirical generalizations about them thus present a special kind of value-relatedness. If you saw my view of validity, this hybrid approach really emerging out of the work by Anita Hubley and I in around consequences and a view of validity that we have been developing, and this hybrid approach that I've been developing, you'll see values and value-relatedness everywhere. Yes, values are part of what we do. That's where I began today. Philosophers of science have already reconciled values with objectivity in several ways. Douglas in 2004 and 2011 in particular does a really lovely work. None of the existing proposals are suitable for the sort of claims made in the use of assessments and surveys, which I would describe as a blending of normative and empirical claims. Some would argue that these blended claims should be eliminated from science. In part, this reflects the early psychometric stance in the disciplinary tension I described earlier. I argue that we should not seek to eliminate these blended claims from the use of assessment and surveys or in assessment and survey studies. Rather, we need to develop principles for their legitimate use. And this is where the horizon, and there's one or more slides and I'll be done. This is what I see coming on the horizon and what I've been trying to advocate. What's next on the horizon was signaled actually by Sam Messick in his work on validity theories, and it's nudged along by the view of validity and fairness, I believe, described herein, that is to find or discover the hidden value propositions in the use and interpretation of assessments. That's what we're talking about. This notion of of arguments, the justificatory and the explanatory. It's about discovering the hidden value propositions. This needs to be systematic and documented as part of the process of validation. Systematic, document as part of the process of validation, interpretation of assessments, surveys, and tests. In some ways, I'm not reflecting something too wild of what's going on in other areas in philosophy, but I'm trying to bring it into what we do. Some of it's already being done. which is lovely. As Addie, Maddox, and I show, this needs in part to focus on disagreements about the empirical claims and making these disagreements public and legitimate, what we call an assembled view of validity. And yes, we are really beginning to talk about a Latourian notion of assemblage in one instantiation, that 2020 paper. Finally, one needs to check if value presuppositions are invariant or robust as disagreements, and if not, to conclude an inclusive deliberation that focuses on disagreements about empirical claims. Where I came from to this, curiously, is in my studies of probability. I mentioned earlier that I lean in a sort of a Definetti view of, if you wish, subjectivist, a personal Bayesian, and there's a lovely paper, I think it was in Psych Methods recently, that talked about different views of Bayesian ideas, really fantastic ideas in that paper. And I really, it's not my paper, it's beautiful work being done. Take a look at that. It's in the last year, it's in 2021, if it just appeared. You'll see about how different Bayesians think about certain things. Well, in my opinion, and the opinion of some Bayesian authors, this notion of checking if the value presuppositions are invariant or robust is fundamental to kind of Bayesian thinking that I have and that I do. I've written about, for example, in 2007 around exchangeability, again in 2021 and in my monograph. Elsewhere, I've argued that this sort of valued-latedness is already part of the science of measurement and testing, and I would argue science more generally. And this is my very last bullet and my very last slide. Pretending that measurement and testing and survey design can be reformulated into value-free claims devalues perfectly good practices and stakes the authority of science of measurement, testing, and survey design interpretation on its separation from the community that it needs and enables. This community of students, parents, policymakers must be viewed from an intersectional point of view. Please see the lovely work by Camilla Adi, Brian Maddox, and I in that 2020, where we argue for a certain way of exposing these ideas.